Exploring China, how did Christian faith first come to China?
Yeah, well, the history in China is really quite remarkable. I like to tell my students that you need to remember that the first missionaries to hit China arrived almost at the exact same time that the first missionaries hit the United Kingdom. That we don't tend to think about those as historically simultaneous moments, but they were within 30 years of one another. And so you have these missionaries arriving in China in around 635, just really early, being sent by the bishops and somewhere in the Middle East. We can't identify exactly where they came from, but somewhere in the Middle East with this message of Jesus. And they called it the luminous religion, this religion of light that they were bringing into China.
How did they get there?
So they followed the Silk Road, this common trafficked area that many people, traders and armies and others had used for centuries, that really linked the Middle East, Central Asia, and East Asia, and they just followed those routes right into the capital city.
And there's still evidence of those people?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, there is now in the city of Xi'an an enormous stele. It's about 9 feet tall. It's much bigger than I am, and it writes down the history of these missionaries and their arrival and their reception by the emperor. And so that's really where a lot of our historical facts come from. But it's not just this huge block, this giant stone, but we have various books that were written as these early missionaries are beginning to try to express the gospel in terms that made sense in a country that was becoming increasingly influenced by Buddhism in particularly. And so that you find them trying to reach for terms that can make sense of the gospel for someone who can really only grasp a spiritual life in Buddhist terms. And so it's a fascinating world to enter.
Now it's a fair few years before the next group of missionaries arrived.
That's right. So this group actually flourished for some time in China, maybe about 200 years of Christianity and its spread and growth, but they got caught in a larger backlash against foreigners, and so the church was largely decimated as a response of that. Not that it was only foreigners there, but it was seen as a foreign religion. And so you have these small waves, 1 or 2 missionaries coming in, or during the Mongolian Empire that sort of spread all across Asia and into Europe. You have Christians sort of beginning to funnel in that large global era. But really, the gospel comes in a more intentional and sustained presence in the 16th century. Around 1583 is when the first missionary has this moment where he's actually invited back into China.
So that group were the Jesuits?
That's right. So the Jesuits arrived. They'd been trying to get into China for some time. They had been working in Japan. They were down in this island of Macau, just off the Chinese coast, for a number of years, maybe 30 years. And finally, they had this invitation to go in. And so really the first missionary group was led by Matteo Ricci.
Now, he's a unique character, isn't he? And what he did in China was unique.
Yeah, he's really remarkable. He had an amazing capacity to learn and absorb the world around him. And so he quickly assessed what was going on in China, and early on, he noticed that people who were religious figures were these Buddhist monks, and so he adopted their dress and tried to look like them, act like them. But he eventually discovered that this was sort of a dead end, that at the time Buddhism was seen as sort of on the outs of sort of fringe characters, maybe a little bit of suspicious even characters, maybe more interested in your money than your soul. And so he ended up adopting a completely different style, and he took on the dress and the clothes of the Confucian scholar. And he was such a success in that, not only because he really learned the Confucian classics, but also because he had this great party trick. These elites would have him over to their house, and they would maybe cite a long poem in Chinese, and when they finished, he would be able to recite it back to them exactly as they had read it.
Wow.
And then not only that, would they say, wow, you've got a great memory, but he would start from the poem at the end and read it and then say it to them backwards, word for word, and that just made him a hit. So people loved to have him around. And that sort of fame, that kind of popularity gave him new opportunities, new open doors, eventually even got him a connection with the emperor.
What do you reckon motivated Ricci? Because that's really unique for that time.
Right. Yes, he and this early group of Jesuit missionaries decided that in East Asia, they were not going to just reproduce Christianity as they knew it in Europe. They were going to have to do something different. They were entering cultures that were extremely sophisticated and complex and had long histories. So they needed to find out, how has God already been active and working here? And so Ricci, for instance, begins to use a name for God that had been in Chinese texts for over 2,000 years and says, God has been here. You've known him as heaven or the Lord of heaven. Now let me tell you more about him.
So Ricci got an invitation to the emperor?
Well, he was able to make it into the imperial court, and this opens up a new phase of missions, primarily because it gives permission for other missionaries to come. Though what we tend to talk about is from that point on, for over 150 years, we have Jesuit missionaries working in the imperial court because they were bringing in new ideas, new knowledge. They were helping construct the calendars in China. And so they became part of this ruling class that were charged with gathering important information for the country.
Do you think it's odd that we often congratulate ourselves today about being great contextualizers for the gospel, and yet here are these Jesuits all these years ago doing exactly that?
Yeah, absolutely. You see a fantastic model in the Jesuits, and if I can even go back to those early missionaries in the 7th century, they were even really pushing for contextualization, trying to find ways to talk about Christianity in terms that made sense to the Buddhists.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we are not the inventors here. We have a great tradition of others who have pioneered this.
One of the next great characters coming into China was Hudson Taylor. What was different about what he did?
Yeah, he's really an amazing man. Protestant missions in China have largely found themselves gathering in Western-controlled parts of China, or at least where there was a lot of Western influence, and they would begin to recreate little Western enclaves and invite people into those, to the church that were based in there. And it was very much sort of, you come to us. And Hudson Taylor breaks this mold and flips it on his head and says, no, the gospel is going to you. And so he leaves the compound, he grows out his hair and puts it in a ponytail, and Chinese fashion style, adopts the clothes, and of course becomes wonderful in the language, and has this really light and flexible ministry that can go inland. And thus he names his mission the China Inland Mission, because he's moving into places no one else has gone before.
It was interesting, it seemed that Hudson Taylor was very successful at gaining more people to join what he was doing.
Yeah, he was a compelling man. He had this incredible personality. I mean, just think of the number of missionaries he was able to bring into China to be part of the organization with him. So he has a certain charisma, but there was also this openness to other people that I think the Chinese found particularly disarming. There was a sense of, for years we've been told, if we're going to become Christian, we have to become like you. And here's this man who says, my goal is to become like you. What an honor he was paying to his hosts in China, and really a remarkable gift he was offering then, the gift that's given for you as you are.
One of the unique things Hudson Taylor did was actually involve more women than most other missionary organizations.
Yeah, the transformation of the lives of women through the gospel in China is one of the most undertold but most fascinating stories, and Hudson Taylor is very much right in the middle of that, along with other missionaries. But there is this idea that women are critical people in this work of God. They are not someone that are just behind the scenes. They are very visible players. And so Hudson Taylor sees them as Bible women, which means that they are equipped to go and to not just spread the gospel, but also disciple other people in the gospel. But what he didn't realize, I think, is all the repercussions this would have. For him, it was really an evangelistic move. We need women to be able primarily to talk to other women who were locked away from men. But what he didn't know is by making them Bible women, they needed to learn the Bible. Well, almost no woman in China could read. And so now you have this new literate class of women emerging. And not only that, but in order to do that, he gives these women maybe a little bit of money, or allows them to raise some money to go and do their work, to travel to the next village, to hold maybe a little revival. And as they're doing this, they are, for the first time, having control of their own resources. That had always been the domain of men. And so now you have this sort of economic independence that these women were experiencing in a tiniest way. It was for the work of God, but they were having this new influence and power there. And then, of course, in the end, what becomes really interesting is sometimes these Bible women were proved to be such effective messengers of the Word of God that Taylor and others were saying, would you go and start the mission? And if your husband and family needs to go along, that's okay too. But this is such a reversal of Chinese expectations that it's the man who's the lead and the woman follows. And now you have this fascinating move where the women become really prominent. And in fact, in China, they become the largest number of believers are women.
This series is called Jesus the Game Changer. What does the phrase Jesus the Game Changer mean for you?
Historically, I think about how Jesus has introduced something new wherever he goes. And when Jesus is named in a place, how you see not just a new community formed, but new prison reforms enacted, or you see new orphanages started. You see people reworking their art and their laws and their architecture. Everything becomes somehow new, not perhaps kingdom of God new, but yet it's radically different than what it was before. And I think that comes out of who Jesus himself is. This is one person that people didn't just say, who is he? They even began to ask, what is he? And there's something about Jesus as God who comes into our presence, God with us, who is so radically new that he changes everything.